are in this series called The Search for Happy because everybody wants to be happy. I mean, being happy is better than not being happy, right? And there's now a lot of research around this. It turns out that joyful people are actually more compassionate than less joyful people. Maybe not that big of a surprise. They're more financially generous than less joyful people. They develop more friendships and deeper friendships than less joyful people. They're more likely to stay married, not shocking. They're more resilient in the face of hardship. And they actually, get this, they actually heal faster from being sick. And so there's all these perks to living a happy life besides just feeling happy. But as followers of Jesus, here's another reason why we need to take joy seriously. Because bitter, angry, critical, judgmental, negative Christians are a stronger argument against Christianity than the strongest argument that any atheist ever put down on paper. I mean, people assume that if Christians, if followers of Jesus are not happy, there's really only one of two explanations. Either it's because they're following Jesus wrong, or because following Jesus makes people unhappy. And most folks will assume, of course, that it's the latter. If they see a grumpy, negative, rude, critical Christian, they'll assume that must be what following Jesus does to people. The way that we live is a reflection of the one that we serve. And so we're thinking hard in this 5-week series about living a life of joy. How do we do it? Because everybody wants to be happy. I don't have to sell you on that idea. We all want to be happy. And today is part 3 of this series that is based on the book of Philippians, this little tiny letter that Paul wrote from prison to the church in Philippi. And today we come to an idea that is foundational for a life of joy. It is the shocking secret, the surprising secret that happy people learn. And it is completely opposite, to be honest with you, of what most people are trying to do most of the time. Here's what Paul writes. Here's how he kind of intros into this idea. He says, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, any encouragement. You have any encouragement from being united with Christ. I love the way he words this. If you have any comfort from his love, if you have any common sharing in the Spirit, if you have any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and one of mind. He says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. Now, these words of Paul were these were game changers in Philippi. Paul here is deliberately subverting the Philippian culture, turning the values of Philippi just on their head. He says, do nothing out of selfish ambition. You ever tried that? Do nothing out of selfish ambition. He says, in humility, value others above yourselves. And then he goes on from here to write some just historically beautiful words about Jesus. But before we get to the Jesus part, I want to spend several minutes describing for you the culture, the setting of Philippi, because it has so much to say to our culture. And I think it'll really help illuminate the words about Jesus that are coming from Paul. And so if you're here this morning and you're not into history, just hang in there, okay? Hang in there with me for a second, because this will make what's coming so much more vivid. As we've talked about, Philippi, if you've been with us in this series, Philippi was a Roman colony, okay? And Roman culture was oriented around status or social recognition that in their culture they called honor, okay? So it was all about what they called the pursuit of honor. They actually had a technical little phrase for it called the race for honor. It was something that you would run after, that you would chase down. And the presence of honor was dependent completely on how others see me. Okay, it was all about how I'm perceived by other people. If they don't think well of me, there's no way I can have honor. It's all about the public perception. And I bring honor to myself and my family, or I bring shame. And Rome was the most status-oriented culture in the ancient world. In fact, ancient Roman philosopher and politician, many of you have heard of Cicero, said it like this. He said, "By nature, we yearn and hunger for honor. And once we have glimpsed its radiance, there is nothing we are not prepared to bear and suffer in order to secure it." Like, this is life. This is everything. Honor. So the secret to happiness in Philippi could be summed up very simply. Okay, advance yourself, promote yourself, serve yourself. And their society was divided into clear ranks or classes in order to make this race for honor clear and motivating for people. And so I'm going to walk through that for you. The basic division was between the elite classes, okay, and the non-elite. Now, only about 2% of the Roman Empire was in the elite category, which means that 98% of the population was just the masses. Okay, and at the bottom of the masses, of the non-elites, were folks who were slaves. Although, of course, there were various categories of slaves, they were all people that had no status, no honor, no control over their lives. Their masters might punish them, their masters might kill them. They had absolutely no personal rights. Okay, they're at the bottom of the ladder. Above them, just a little bit above them, were what were called freedmen. Okay, and these are people who, they're not actually slaves, and so they're not in the slave category, but they don't have many rights. And then above them in the next category, still part of the non-elites, were citizens of the Roman Empire, okay, Roman citizens. Now, most folks living, say, in Philippi would not have been citizens of Rome. Okay, so this is still a minority of folks. But to be a citizen of Rome meant that you had several rights that the non-citizens didn't have. So you automatically had higher status than them. And then a very small group of people in the elite, okay, in the elite category, were people that were known as equestrians. And that might be a familiar word for many of you. Originally, equestrians were simply people who had enough money to be able to buy horses and take them into battle. And then above them would be a very small now, very elite group, people who were members of the Roman Senate, okay, senators. And then at the very top, there was an emperor who was known as what? Caesar. Yes, Caesar. Just one guy for this spot. I mean, this is as elite as it gets. Okay, so this is the ladder. This is what everybody's trying to climb. And everything in their society was arranged to reinforce and stimulate people's race for honor. For example, people's clothes were all about their status. Now, in our culture, you go, well, you can tell, kind of, I guess. People's, not really. Okay, if for them, clothes, they were an absolute definition of status. If you were a freedman, you were able to wear a special hat. And it sounds kind of goofy to us, but it was called a freedman's cap. And you would wear it with pride because it would tell everybody, at least I'm not a slave. Okay, at least I'm not one of them. At least I'm a rung up from somebody. And if you were a citizen, you could wear a toga. And many of you are familiar, or you know what a toga is, and you might remember that it was associated with ancient Rome. But it was actually a status and honor deal. Okay, if you were not a citizen, you were forbidden to wear a toga. And they were actually kind of like a pain to wrap, and they were uncomfortable to wear. But folks wanted to wear them. They absolutely wanted to wear them because they wanted people to know, I'm certainly not a slave, and I'm not just a mere freedman. Okay, I'm a citizen. I'm way above all of these other folks. Now, if you were an equestrian, not only could you wear a toga, but you were also allowed to wear a gold ring. And that was a way of saying, I'm not just an average citizen. Okay, I'm like way up here. And then the senators, a level above the equestrians. Not only could senators wear a gold ring and a toga, but they could wear a toga with a purple stripe on it. Wouldn't that be cool? So if you were an equestrian, you couldn't wear the purple stripe. So the purple stripe really, as a senator, set you apart. And then, of course, Caesar had all kinds of perks, all kinds of things he could wear, like a crown. And not only did clothing vary, but you see in their culture that legal rights varied depending on your class. Even the legal system was designed to reinforce status. Your rights and your punishments completely depended upon your rank. Like our deeply held value, one of the foundational core principles of our nation is that everybody is equal before God and equal before the law. But that's not how it was in Rome. For instance, Roman citizens could not be flogged. They could not be punished that way. Non-citizens could be flogged. And if you know about Paul, you know his story, when he was first preaching the gospel in Philippi, when he first went there, he was arrested for it and then flogged. But he was able to get out of jail because it turns out Paul was actually a Roman citizen. So he went to the authorities after his arrest and flogging and let them know that they had broken the law by flogging him. So they panicked because they could be in huge trouble for that. Big deal. And so they pleaded and pleaded with Paul to just go quietly. And they let him out of prison and they said, just go away. Now here's the obvious question when you think about that. The obvious question is, if you were Paul and you were about to be flogged and you were about to be like whipped and have your back just laid bare, wouldn't you tell them that you were a Roman citizen before that happened? And what's interesting is, apparently Paul, a citizen of Rome, was not wearing the toga. He was dressed just like a lower class, average, everyday peasant. And he was there teaching about Jesus, no toga. They would have never flogged him in the first place if he'd just had the right clothing on. And for some reason, as he's being prepared to be flogged, he says nothing about his citizenship. Apparently, Paul refused to use his elevated status to get any kind of perks. Even if it meant excruciating suffering. Now, I wonder where he got that idea. Okay, let's come back to that. Okay, the most dishonorable status, obviously, was that of a slave, and the most dishonoring punishment was to be hung on a cross. Now, the Romans were quite good at capital punishment. They couldn't stop thinking up better and better ways to kill people. And they used many forms of it. But the most dishonoring, most disgraceful, most humiliating was crucifixion. And it was generally reserved for slaves because its purpose was not just to kill, it was to humiliate. In fact, in Rome, they had kind of a technical phrase for it. It was called the slave's punishment. So clothing was used to reinforce status and honor, and the justice system was used to reinforce honor. Everything imaginable in their culture was used to reinforce it. Like seating at public events was all about status. I was trying to think of analogies in our day that we've all experienced. Here's what I would compare it to. It's a little bit like flying. Like in our day, if you're going on a flight and you have the best seats, you're flying in what class? First. Yeah, you're flying in first class. Some places call it business class, but I like first even better. Because you're not second class, man. You're not economy class. You're not coach. You're not with all the rabble back there. In fact, they put up a little curtain so that the rabble doesn't even get to look into the Holy of Holies, where all of the first-class passengers are. And in Philippi, if you went to a public event, like an athletic contest or to the theater, the seating was arranged, not as it is in our day by ticket price, but it was actually arranged by status, The senators sat closest to the stage, and then the equestrians, and so on. And it was actually illegal if you were just a citizen to sneak up into one of the higher status areas. You'd be arrested for that. And so what I'm saying is status was everything. Status or honor was a public commodity. And so people were always trying to climb. That was the whole goal of life. You got to climb. You got to raise up. But people almost never went, as much as they tried, they almost never went from one category to a completely different category. Each category had several levels within. So among senators, for instance, there were several offices, and some offices were much higher than others. They were way more prestigious. And so if you were a senator, the race for you, the race for honor, was to try always to climb to a higher office. And the same was true even for slaves. There were many, many slaves and many types of slaves. And even among slaves, there were different levels of slaves. And so success was climbing to a higher position as a slave. This was true for all of the classes. This was life. It was a race for honor. Now, sometimes people would lose status for some reason. Like maybe their behavior, or maybe a loss of wealth or whatever. But they would actually descend from a higher title to a lower title. And in the Roman culture, in Philippi, they had a very technical expression for that. The loss of status was called being humbled. And this was like the worst thing that could ever happen to you. Literally, the worst thing that could ever happen to you. Nobody ever volunteered for it. Nobody ever said, hey, I think I'd like to be humbled. But sadly, it happened to people. And it was always considered a tragedy when it did. The Roman historian Pliny, very famous Roman historian, wrote, "It is more uglifying to lose praise than to never get praise." Like it's far more tragic to lose your status, to go down, to be humbled, than just to have never climbed at all. And this is life in Rome. This is especially life in Philippi. Interestingly enough, there are more records of these titles and offices, like inscriptions of the race for honor in the account of people's lives. There are more records of those in Philippi than any other city in ancient Roman Empire. But Paul is about to describe the values of a completely different kingdom. He's about to show them the way of a different kind of king. And this new kingdom turns everything in Philippi, everything in Rome on its head. Paul writes, "In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage." And Paul is using loaded language here, and everybody knows it. Okay, that phrase, "in nature God," is used in the Old Testament to describe the visible manifestation of God's glory. In other words, Paul is saying that Christ is actually clothed in God's glory. Christ is clothed in majesty. Christ is clothed in splendor, but he refused to leverage his status for his own advantage. He says, rather, he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, of a slave, made in human likeness. With Jesus, there was no crown, there was no purple stripe, there was no gold ring, there was no citizen's toga, there wasn't even a freedman's cap. And Paul deliberately uses the word servant here, literally slave. Jesus has gone from the highest position to the lowest. He's volunteered for the ultimate downgrade, like to be the Lord of all and yet to become a slave. And he doesn't stop there. Paul goes on, verse 8, it says, "And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself." What? Yeah, he humbled himself. Again, in ancient Rome, the Roman world, sometimes people got humbled. Like, just bad things just happen, man. But nobody humbled themselves voluntarily. Jesus humbled himself voluntarily. He took a divine downgrade. Paul says he humbled himself and became obedient. Nobody desired to become obedient in Rome. The Romans hated that word. The term was a term for a child, be obedient, or a term for a slave, be obedient. It was a term of weakness. Great people made other people obey. Okay, you'd never describe a great person as somebody that was obedient. But Paul says Jesus humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And that's as low as it's possible to go. That's the ultimate humiliation for the lowest status person on the face of the earth. The Lord of all has become a crucified slave. Like, that's the Son of God. That's God. What is God like? That's what God is like. And this made no sense to people in the Roman context. This is why Paul says that to the Gentiles, the cross of Christ is just foolishness. Like, it is a loser strategy. But it turns out, see, Paul's saying, it turns out Rome is wrong. And so he concludes, therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Paul says Jesus humbles himself. Okay, but one day he will actually be the most exalted. God will raise him up and all will see. All will respond. And you remember in Rome, honor isn't honor, of course, unless it's public. And Paul says one day, guys, one day, just know this is going to be like really public. Every knee in heaven and every knee on earth and every knee under the earth is going to bend. And every day, or and one day, every tongue in heaven and on earth and below the earth is going to confess that actually Caesar isn't Lord at all. That Jesus, the crucified slave, is Lord of all. See, the kingdom of Jesus, the kingdom of the King of Kings, the kingdom of God, is lived out in this new reality, where the first end up being last, where the great ones humble themselves and become the servants. And it broke into the kingdom of Rome, and it broke into the kingdom of Philippi, and now it's breaking into, in little ways, it's breaking into the kingdom of Greater Seattle. And the shocking secret that happy people learn is that joy lies not through the advancement of self, but by death to self. And the same Jesus that came then is the same Jesus that comes now to you and me, and he comes right here, right now. And this is like, guys, this is the weirdest like recruiting slogan in history. He comes and he says, hey, here's what we should do. Take up your cross and follow me. Now, who in their right mind would start a movement with that slogan? And how in the world would a movement in the Roman culture in places like Philippi with a slogan like that ever catch on? How is that possible? But Jesus says, he said it then and he's saying it now. Do you want to follow me? Then deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me. Die to your selfish, self-serving, self-promoting ways. In humility, value others, serve others, seek the advancement of others above the advancement of yourself. Take up your cross, deny yourself, like your fearful, petty, small-minded, me-first, ladder-climbing self. Just die to that so that the you God planned, like a nobler, better, truer you, might live. And the shocking secret that joyful followers of Jesus learn is that joy comes not through the indulging of my selfish nature, but actually by dying to it. And Paul begins his letter, if you remember, he begins his letter to the church in Philippi with this. He says, from Paul, a slave of Christ Jesus. He's like, guys, here's who I am. You want to know who I am? Who's writing this to you? The authority I have? He's like, I'm a slave of a slave. And not just that, but Paul says, I have been, this is in Galatians 2:20, he says, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. He says, I am the crucified slave of a crucified slave. Paul is just like, how low can you go? And so is it any wonder that Paul, and you think about his life and his example, is it any wonder that Paul was not wearing a toga when he was preaching about Jesus in Philippi? That he would allow himself to be flogged. He could die from that. He would allow himself to be flogged before he would claim citizenship to get out of it. It's like he didn't see his status as something to be used to his own advantage. It's like Paul really believed what he wrote here. Like he modeled this in Philippi years and years before he ever asked them to do it. See, Jesus comes to you and to me, and he says, take up your cross. And I know that this raises all kinds of questions and objections and alarm bells for us. We're just going, whew. You mean I have to voluntarily sacrifice myself? You mean I have to put limits on how much I can accumulate? You mean I have to forgo achieving all that I can and instead focus on lifting others up? You mean I have to watch people get ahead of me and actually cheer them on? You mean I have to forgo comfort, security, and pleasure that I'd be able to afford to disadvantage my lifestyle for the benefit of other people? And I would say, of course not. You don't have to do that. Very few people actually do that. You don't have to do that. But that is the way of Jesus. That is the way of Jesus. That is how the kingdom of God breaks into earth. That is the secret to a joy-filled life. You don't have to do it. Here's the secret that happy people learn. The more I try to outclimb and outshine everyone else, the more that's my focus and chief principle life goal, the more miserable I'll become. And the more miserable I'll make everybody around me. And you think about it, where does this life strategy lead? Where does this life strategy take us? That's just self-advancement, self-pursuit. Let me climb over people. It takes us into fear. It takes us into jealousy. It takes us into arrogance. It makes everybody around us a competitor in our game in one way or another. It builds walls and it destroys community. You think about the people that you've known that have just abandoned themselves to that philosophy. You ever met somebody like that? Just unapologetic? The ones that will step on your head just to climb up half an inch. Who have those people been in your life? I'll bet you've known some. You think about them. Were they happy? Did they exude and spread joy? When we die to the desire to climb and instead focus on serving, it's amazing what happens. The joy is just contagious. Community is built. It's like learning to live in a different kingdom. My dad lives in Northern California, and you want to talk about a different kingdom. I'm just kidding. Don't do anything with that. I'm not suggesting anything by that. I wasn't going to say it. Just occurred to me in the moment, and sometimes the Spirit's not leading me. But my dad lives in Northern California, and he has for several decades. And so he is a huge San Francisco Giants fan, and I love him anyway. But this last week, he sent me an article that he came across. And it's a little unusual because it was written actually by an actual baseball player, not by a journalist. And it was written by one of the young stars of the Giants. His name is Matt Duffy. And it's a story about his breaking into the big leagues. But more than that, it's really a story about people serving each other. It's about the joy of being a part of a community where service and humility is central to it. And so I just want to read for you the article. Here's Matt Duffy's take on the San Francisco Giants. He says, it was the first day of school with one small difference. School was the San Francisco Giants. I had just gotten called up to the big leagues. I walked into the visitors' clubhouse at Citi Field in New York. You remember the feeling? Weak knees, a swarm of bees in your gut, conscious of every step. I was the new kid in class. I knew almost nobody on the big league team, which is kind of unusual. Most players making their major league debuts have spent at least a little time with the big leaguers during spring training. Not me. I had been an 18th round draft pick in 2012, not exactly at the top of anybody's, hey, watch this guy list. Only having had a single season of A-ball under my belt, I spent all of spring training in 2014 in minor league camp. So when I walked into that clubhouse, I was a total stranger. Like I said, new kid in class. But no sooner had I found my locker, there was my name right there in the same room as Buster Posey and Madison Bumgarner. Then Hunter Pence appeared at my side. He introduced himself and shook my hand and congratulated me. Hey, man, he said, You have to go out there and compete. You have to be aggressive. And then he said something that floored me. He said, we need you, man. Let's go. I was just 23 and just up from Double A. Nobody had ever heard of me, but Hunter Pence had just come to me and said, we need you. And the we he was talking about was the San Francisco Giants. That seemed crazy to me. But as I soon learned, it wasn't crazy. That's just the Giants' way. My conversation with Hunter began a succession of welcoming handshakes and confidence boosters from the team. Buster, Brandon Crawford, everyone. Play big, they told me. Let's win some games, they told me. The younger guys with their own debuts still pretty fresh told me not to pay attention to the names on the backs of the jerseys. Oh, and one more piece of advice they gave me, don't look up. What does that mean? Well, minor league parks usually just have one level. A few parks, the really nice ones, have 2 levels, but never 3. Don't look up. First thing I did was look up. I went out to batting practice at Citi Field, and I looked up, and I looked up, and I looked up. The rows of seats seemed to climb forever. I was in awe. I mean, how could I not be? I was in Single A year ago. It's hard to turn off being a fan. The same sensation grabbed at me in the 3rd game of our series when we went up against Bartolo Colon. I had watched Bartolo as a kid in Long Beach growing up when he was with the Angels. I'd rooted for him. I'd watched him win a Cy Young. And so when he took the mound that day, I was thinking more along the lines of, should I snap a photo? My mind was nowhere near the mode of thinking, how do I beat this guy? And of course, I didn't beat him. I went 0 for 5, just like a fan would. The next stop on the road trip was Milwaukee. When a bunch of guys went out to dinner one night, they pulled me along. They fed me like Italian mothers. Eat this, eat that, you're too skinny, order whatever you want. I was the center of attention, but in a positive way. There was none of the belittling or dismissiveness that I know happens on some teams. My only, and he's got it in quotes, my only chore as a rookie was to bring a bag of beer from the plane onto the bus for the drive to the hotel. I couldn't have been happier to do it. Before long, I realized that this, like all of this, wasn't just guys being nice. Instead, it was one of the very real secrets to the Giants' success, that their young players adjust quickly to life in the big leagues. From rookie Buster Posey taking over the starting catcher's job on the 2010 World Series team, to rookie Joe Panik playing unbelievably at second base in the World Series last year, to rookie pitcher Chris Heston throwing a no-hitter this year. He says that stuff's not random. It's a pattern, and patterns don't happen by accident. I wanted to be a part of that pattern, so I buckled down and got to work. No more fandom, just learning. I'd watch Buster strike out in a big situation and come back to the dugout, never cursing or throwing stuff, remaining as cool as could be. And I'd learn a lot from that, about just how much failure and dealing with failure is a part of Major League Baseball, about how preparation and not outcome is what a smart player will focus on. Buster accepted his micro failures and moved on to the next at-bat. If the best guy on the team can do that, how can't I? I'd watch Crawford at shortstop. He's so calm on the field. Even if the runner is extremely fast, Crawford never looks like he's rushing. You're sure the runner's going to beat the throw, except then you blink and there's the ball at first base ahead of the runner. It's almost like a magic trick, a sleight of hand. The slower Craw goes, the faster he makes the play. Don't rush. That lesson has already made me a better ball player. But the lesson that's meant the most to me came from Casey McGahee. Casey was the Giants' starting third baseman this season, signed last December to replace Pablo Sandoval. I made the team out of spring training as his backup. Right from the start, Casey took me under his wing. He taught me something every day, a tip here, pointer there. Really, every day with Casey, I learned something new. Even on his off days when I'd play for him, he'd help me from the bench, scout for me, talk me through things, adjust my positioning depending on how a batter was swinging. When Casey began to struggle, my name appeared in the starting lineup more and more. And still, he coached and mentored me. On May 26th, we were in Colorado to play the Rockies. It was a couple of hours before the game, and Casey tapped me on the shoulder. "Step into my office," he said. leading me to a storage closet in the Rockies visiting clubhouse. He shut the door. I thought he was just giving me another pointer, or maybe I did something wrong that I hadn't realized. Then I saw tears in his eyes. And I thought, oh no. I knew immediately. Hey, they're sending me out, he said. I just want you to understand that this isn't your fault. You did what you were supposed to do, which is to force the issue. And you did that. And you shouldn't feel bad. You did great. When I was a rookie in Milwaukee, I took Bill Hall's job, and I felt bad for a month, probably more. I don't want you to do that. That's really important to me. Do not feel bad for 1 second. I didn't know what to say. It was a stunning gesture. In that moment, he had shown me what true generosity and selflessness looked like. He had lifted a huge weight off my shoulders. This amazing thing had happened to me, and I didn't have to feel guilty. It was like Hunter wiping away my fear and anxiety during those first few minutes at my locker, but on a much bigger scale. Both moments, in their own way, delivered the same message. We're a band of brothers, and we look out for each other. On August 3rd, a AAA infielder named Kelby Tomlinson, a 12th round draft pick, walked into our clubhouse. He'd just been called up to fill in at second base for an injured Joe Panik. I found him sitting in front of his locker reading scouting reports. Hey, congratulations, I said, giving him a big hug. We knew each other from the minors. We need you, I told him. You're a key part of this team now. We need you to play the way you know you can play. We need you to help us win games. I told him not to pay attention to the names on the back of the jerseys. I told him not to look up. Whatever you do, don't look up. He looked up. But then, like all of us, he got the hang of it. As of September 14th, Kelby has a .304 average. And recently, he hit a grand slam and a clutch walk-off single to help us beat the Cardinals. He's seeing the ball, and he's letting things go. And maybe it didn't matter what I told him that day. Maybe none of these things matter. But I like to think they do. And I like to think that he'll pay it forward to the next young guy who comes through the Giants clubhouse, who walks to his locker with weak knees and bees in his gut. Don't look up, he'll tell him. Look forward. Now, I have to be honest. I don't know if any of these guys follow Jesus. But here's what I do know. And I've seen it over and over and over. When people let go of trying to stack up, and instead they focus on how they can build up, beautiful things start happening. They do. And joy is present, and it spreads. And so I just want to close by asking you to think about your world these days. Like the environments that you go into every day. Your family, your workplace, the gym where you work out, the group of mommies that you hang out with, or the dudes you play fantasy football with, or your soccer team, or your friends at school. Think about the places that you go and the people that you see there. And I'll tell you the secret to joy that happy people learn. If you die to that internal drive to outclimb and outshine, and if instead the servant in you is awakened and comes alive, joy is inevitable. It's inevitable. So serve your coworkers. Serve your friends. Serve your family. Quit worrying if they notice you, if they respect you. Notice them. Respect them. Encourage them. Love them. It's amazing what happens when it stops being all about you. And this is the shocking secret happy people learn. When it stops being about you, joy comes.